So first of all, let me state, I think what you're saying, and then probably give an example that's actually not a Myers-Briggs example, because I think that'll be easier for us to understand, I think. So what I hear you saying, just to reiterate, is that the behaviors that I see in somebody, let's just pick an age, like 20. The behaviors I see at somebody at 20 might look similar to behaviors of somebody that is at 80 years old. But because I may not be factoring in, if I'm not a personal growth person and tuned into how maturation works, because that's how we're defining personal growth, if I'm not tuned into that, I might conflate and say, well, that 80-year-old is the same personality type as the 20-year-old because they're doing the same behaviors. And I think what your argument is, well, maturation, attunement to maturation, having gone through it myself and always being focused on what does maturation look like? What does personal growth look like? I'm able to look at the 80-year-old person and say, they've been through some stuff. They've had to figure some things out. So we may not be able to assume that they're doing those behaviors for the same reasons as that 20-year-old. That 20-year-old might be doing them for very lower level reasons or more basic reasons. They haven't matured as much. They haven't seen as much stuff in life. And so that 80-year-old, we have to account for the life they've been through as we're looking at their cognition, as we're examining their personality type, as we're understanding them as a person, and not just their type, but the whole person. There's a bunch of things that they've probably been through that have had to calibrate and they've had to figure out, and that's going to make them show up different. Even if they're the same personality type, maybe they're exhibiting completely different behaviors, but they're the same on paper personality type as the 20-year-old, but they look so different. So they can't be that type because that 20-year-old's looking like this, so you can't be the same type as the 20-year-old.
Right.
And so that maturation process, really tuning into it, helps us understand how people go through life and how they might exhibit different qualities and characteristics, because you're certainly not going to be the same person at 20 and as at 80. Like, you're going to be different, whether you've been in personal growth or not. Your life experience will change you.
Right. Yeah. Life itself seasons and matures us.
Yeah.
And so understanding development helps us understand how type is different on that developmental line, that timeline of life, regardless of whether or not growth is in there.
Yeah.
You add the component of growth, which is accelerated maturity, and now it throws all of the instruments off.
So let's use the Enneagram as a good example here. The Enneagram is set up, the way we understand it, the way we teach it, and the way our colleagues Beatrice and Aranio talk about it is, I'm an Enneagram social 6, for example, and they say, that's not what you are. And so when I'm first learning the Enneagram as a social 6, I start to over-identify with the social 6 and all the characteristics of the fear and the push-pull with authority and all the things that a social 6, quote unquote, has a personality type around. But if I'm on my maturation and personal growth path, the social 6 is exactly what I'm not. In fact, a 6 in the Enneagram is the most courageous type. It's right in the middle of the fear triad. But yet, in a maturation experience, I'm the most courageous of all the Enneagram types, supposedly, right? I mean, sure, there's other courageous types, but you get the point. I'm oversimplifying this for the sake of argument. So to look at me and say, oh, you can't be a 6 if I'm in my 70s or 80s because you don't have fear and you don't have a push-pull relationship with authority. And how could you possibly be a 6? Look how courageous you are. Well, no, that actually proves the point. In understanding my type, I've worked on myself to get to the place where that doesn't define me anymore, which is the whole point of using a system like the Enneagram. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is what we're saying. There's a corollary here to the Myers-Briggs system as well. Now, it's a little bit harder, I think, to see inside the Myers-Briggs system because it's not set up in the same framework as the Enneagram. That's why I use the Enneagram as an example. Mm-hmm. But there's something almost not identical, but very similar happening in the Myers-Briggs system that's happening in the Enneagram system is, if I'm a maturing ENFP, over time, I'm going to look less like a quote unquote stereotypical ENFP because I'm balancing myself out. I'm rounding out my personality. I'm overcoming some of my one-sidedness. I'm becoming a whole person. I'm individuating and I'm becoming complete over the cycle of my life if I'm attuned to growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you're also sort of killing and rebirthing your ego over and over.
Yeah.
And so there are characteristics that come through that are experiential in that growth phase that if you haven't experienced them, it's hard to understand how much impact they have on how a person is going to show up. So it's not that if you are not into personal growth, your theoretical understanding of type is going to be inaccurate. It's going to have a glass ceiling. It's not going to be able to touch on people who have gone through these accelerated maturation processes and come out the other side a bunch of question marks, right? I have such a hard time finding this person's type. We talk about it in a bell curve. People who have done a lot of personal growth work are very difficult to profile. And people who are very unhealthy versions of their type, sometimes, sometimes they're easy to figure out just because they're so stereotypical. But if they're really unhealthy, that throws off the instruments too.
Yeah.
So if you want to be able to understand the edges of the bell curve, then you have to understand how growth and development works in a more experiential way, because it is, again, hard to understand how much that influences. So I think looking at the person who's like 20 and 80 to bring it down to a type, to Myers-Briggs type concepts, it's very rare for, like, let's take, for example, somebody with INTJ preferences. It's very rare for somebody with INTJ preferences to be super chatty when they're in their teens. Now, they might have been chatty as a little kid, right? As the earliest part of their ego is forming. But by the time they get to, I don't know, like around puberty, there are INTJs that are chatty, but it's pretty rare. But it's way more common for older people who have INTJ preferences to be chatty, because they've gone through a lot of stuff that taught them the value of it, the value of offering and the value of communicating. And they might have had a career that required it. And, it's like they're going to be a little bit more offering because, they're not so worried about, in puberty, you're totally worried about this idea of mating, right? Like, who's going to want me? And you're so plugged into everybody else's approval in order to be part of the, sort of the marketplace. But by the time you're like in your 50s, 60s, 70s, that's not you still want to be attractive, and if you're single, you still want to attract a mate, but it's not your all-consuming thought.
Yeah.
And you're tapped into your own sense of approval at that point. So you're actually trying to self-approve. And therefore, you're going to have learned a lot of mechanisms, most likely, to not be so withdrawn. You're going to have a little bit more of an openness and a chattiness. So if you're talking to somebody who's in their 70s and they figured out the value of being chatty, and so you're talking to a chatty person and they say, I have INTJ preferences, and you're like, no, you don't, because INTJs are super quiet. It's like, you're talking to somebody with 7 decades of life experience.
Yeah.
It's not going to show up like the meme, all right? It's not going to show up in a cartoonized way. It's going to show up in a more seasoned, mature, developed expression. And so growth, again, it accelerates maturity. So it brings some of those characteristics a little sooner, a little earlier in the process. And an understanding of the life cycle of a type, or the life cycle of type in and of itself and how it develops, that will give you an insight into how personal growth might sort of bring in what is the opposite of dilate? It's like that brings sort of in
contract.
Yeah, exactly. That life cycle. A person who is in their 40s or 50s who is really dedicated to growth and development might have some of those qualities and characteristics that normally would only be reserved for them in much later time periods.
Yeah.
They might be tapped into that. And so that's why I made the statement that if you're not into personal growth, if you don't understand how it works, then you're going to be missing some components of type theory.